Welcome to the Mystery and Horror channel. Get ready for dark stories that will give you chills. Before we start, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe, and hit the bell to stay tuned for every new mystery. Now turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let's dive into terror. Story 1. The Key to the Locked Room. When I bought my first house, an old building in the city center, I was captivated by the architectural details. The place had been built at the beginning of the last century and had features that told stories of another time. Exposed wooden beams, colorful stained glass, and a large crystal chandelier hanging over the main staircase. However, there was a room on the upper floor that was always locked. The key was supposedly lost, according to the agent, and the room had never been used. My curiosity drove me to search for that key. After weeks of rummaging through drawers and hidden compartments, I finally found it in a small wooden box forgotten in a basement cabinet. The key was old, with intricate details forming a pattern of spirals. With my heart pounding, I climbed the stairs and inserted it into the rusted lock. The sound of the latch moving echoed through the empty house. The room was dusty, with furniture covered in sheets that had yellowed over time. A window with heavy curtains let in a weak light, revealing an old, gold-framed mirror that took up nearly an entire wall. The air was still, heavy, with a faint musty smell lingering. As I looked at the distorted reflection in the mirror, a sense of unease overcame me. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, a slow dragging as if something was moving across the wooden floor. I turned quickly, but there was nothing, only silence. Yet, in the mirror, a shadow flitted by like a figure hiding. My instincts told me to leave, but curiosity kept me rooted. Night fell, and I tried to distract myself, but the thought of the room in the mirror wouldn't leave my mind. The feeling that something was different in the house unsettled me. The sound of a soft knock echoed from upstairs, like a door swaying gently. I grabbed a flashlight and ascended the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The door to the room that I had left open was now ajar, moving slightly as if pushed by an invisible draft. When I entered, the flashlight flickered, and the room was cast in an eerie dimness. I looked at the mirror, and my reflection seemed paler, the eyes slightly sunken. A chill ran down my spine, and the mirror began to fog as if someone were breathing on the other side. Words formed, written by unseen fingers. "You shouldn't have come." Fear seized me, and I started to back away, but the door slammed shut. The flashlight went out completely, plunging the room into suffocating darkness. A faint whisper echoed, a sad female voice saying, "Help me." My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. The air grew cold, and I felt as if someone brushed past me, a cold touch that left me paralyzed. When the flashlight flickered back to life, the mirror was clear, and the door had swung open. I bolted out of the room, slamming it shut and locking it again. The next day, I covered the mirror with a sheet and locked the door once more. But at night, when silence enveloped the house, I could still hear the faint whisper echoing through the halls, "Help me." Since then, I avoid that room, but sometimes when the wind blows and doors creak, I remember the mirror and the voice that still seems to call out to me, waiting for someone to finally heed its plea. Story 2. The Diary of the Unknown Girl. In my great-aunt's house, there was an attic that always intrigued me. It was a dusty place, full of old boxes and furniture covered with yellowed sheets. As a child, I wasn't allowed to go up there, but after my great-aunt passed away and the house was left to me, I felt it was time to explore its secrets. One afternoon, I climbed the narrow stairs that creaked under my weight and pushed open the heavy door. The faint light filtering through the roof slats illuminated rows of boxes and old furniture. While rummaging through the space, I found a small wooden box locked with a rusted padlock. The lock was nearly loose, and with a gentle pull, I managed to open it. Inside was a leather-bound diary with yellowed pages and the strong scent of old paper. I started leafing through it, filled with entries written in delicate handwriting. The first pages were filled with flower sketches and descriptions of the daily life of a girl named Laura, who seemed to have lived in the house many decades ago. But as the pages progressed, the tone of the diary changed. She mentioned hearing voices at night and seeing shadows dancing around her room. One of the last pages was smeared with ink, as if her hand had trembled while writing. "They come when the moon is full." I feel like I'm being watched all the time, it read. A chill ran down my spine and I closed the diary with a snap. That night, I stored it in a drawer in my room and tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. Around midnight, a soft sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. I sat up in bed, heart racing. The footsteps stopped outside my door, followed by a faint whisper, "Laura?" I got up slowly and moved to the door, listening closely. When I opened it, the hallway was empty, but a cold draft passed over me, making my skin prickle. The attic door, which I had left shut, was now open, and a faint light came from within. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed the stairs again, each step creaking like a warning. Upstairs, everything seemed as I had left it, except for the diary, now open in the middle of the floor, to a page I didn't recall reading. "They are here," it said, with a drawing of a tall, thin figure with hollow eyes staring back at me. The flashlight flickered, and the air grew colder. A soft sound of children's laughter echoed through the attic, mixed with a deeper, drawn-out whisper that said, "Laura is not alone anymore." I backed away, fear pulsing through my veins. The diary closed by itself, the thud echoing like thunder. I ran down the stairs and locked the attic door, panting. For the rest of the night, the soft sound of footsteps and distant laughter continued, as if the house were full of unseen presences. The next morning, I took the diary to a local historian, who told me that the house had belonged to a family that mysteriously disappeared in the 1940s. Laura was the youngest daughter, and no trace of her or her parents was ever found. Since then, the diary remains stored in a metal box, and the attic door is always locked. But on full moon nights, I still hear the faint whisper and the sound of footsteps, reminding me that Laura's story still echoes through the house, waiting to be told. Story 3, The Music in the Forest. In the town where I grew up, there was a dense, old forest that everyone said was haunted. The older townspeople spoke of music that could be heard at dusk, echoing among the trees like a soft, hypnotic melody. They said it was the sound of a violin played by a lost musician who never left the forest. No one knew exactly where the story came from, but it was enough to keep most people away from the place after nightfall. One afternoon, my best friend Lucas and I decided to explore the forest. We were teenagers and wanted to prove that the legends were just that, legends. We brought flashlights and followed the main trail, which soon disappeared among the tall trunks and elongated shadows of the trees. The air was cool, but there was an eerie calm. There were no sounds of birds or wind, just the faint rustle of leaves under our feet. As the sun began to set, the forest was enveloped in a golden twilight. That's when we heard it, a soft violin melody carried by the wind weaving through the trees. We stopped and exchanged a surprised look. Lucas laughed nervously, saying it must be a local practicing nearby. But the sound seemed to come from everywhere, as if the entire forest were singing. We decided to follow the music, which grew louder as we went. The deeper we ventured, the more the forest seemed to close in around us. The shadows of the trees moved in strange ways, almost as if they were watching us. The melody intensified, and for a moment, we swore we saw a figure in the distance, holding a violin and moving with quick, elegant gestures. "Hey, who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound brave. The figure stopped and slowly turned toward us. Even in the dim light, we could see that the face was covered by a pale mask with a faint trace of a frozen smile. Lucas grabbed my arm, saying it was time to leave, but before we could move, the music stopped, and the silence that followed was overwhelming. A whisper echoed through the trees, "Come dance with me." The words repeated in a low chorus, blending with the sound of light footsteps approaching. I looked around, but the figure was gone. However, smaller shadows began to shift between the trees, as if dancing to a song we could no longer hear. Terror gripped us, and we began to run in the direction we had come. Footsteps and laughter echoed behind us, as if an invisible crowd was chasing us. Our flashlights bounced in our hands, casting lights and shadows that only added to our confusion. When we finally saw the forest's edge, the music returned, louder and more intense. I stopped for a moment and looked back, seeing the masked musician waving slowly before vanishing into the darkness. We reached home breathless and silent, unable to explain what we had seen. Lucas and I promised never to speak of it again, but the sound of the melody continued to echo in my mind. In the days that followed, townspeople reported hearing the forest's music, but no one dared to enter. To this day, when the wind blows at night, I swear I hear the distant sound of a violin, inviting those who dare to dance with the lost musician. And sometimes, when the moon is high and the town sleeps, I see shadows dancing at the forest's edge, as if the party never ended. Story 4. The Cursed Painting. My mother was an antique collector, and our house was always filled with curious objects, from ceramic vases to old, hand-carved furniture. One day, she brought home a painting she found at an auction. It depicted a dark landscape with a small house and a gnarled tree in front of it. The sky was a deep gray, and the shadows in the painting seemed to move as the light changed. As soon as the painting was hung in the living room, an unsettling feeling washed over me. The first night after the painting was put up, I woke to the sound of soft footsteps in the hallway. I thought it was my mother, but the sound stopped outside my door and didn't continue. I lay there in silence, waiting for more, but nothing happened. I went back to sleep, but the unease lingered. The next day, when I returned from school, I noticed the painting was slightly askew, as if it had been touched. I straightened it, thinking it was just a draft, and went on with my day. That night, while we were having dinner, my mother mentioned she'd been having strange dreams since she brought the painting home. Dreams of the house in the painting and a tall figure watching from inside the window. I laughed nervously, trying to change the subject, but the truth was, I had also been having nightmares. Over the next few days, things got worse. The shadows in the painting seemed more defined, and I could swear the window of the house looked darker, as if something was hiding inside. One night, as I studied in the living room, the light from the lamp flickered, and the painting seemed to glow for a moment. When the light stabilized, the reflection in the window clearly showed a silhouette with empty eyes staring at me. I jumped up and went to my room, closing the door and trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But the sound of footsteps returned, this time accompanied by a faint whisper that seemed to echo through the house. "Can you see us?" My heart raced and I could barely breathe. My mother knocked on the door, worried, and when I opened it, she was pale. She said she'd heard a low laugh coming from the living room. That night, we decided to cover the painting with a sheet and move it to the basement. The air in the house felt lighter, but as I closed the basement door, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of nails scratching the wood coming from inside. The voice returned, clearer and more insistent. "You can't lock me away forever." We spent the following days avoiding the painting, but knew something was different in the house. Objects moved on their own, shadows appeared where they shouldn't, and the sound of footsteps continued to echo, always stopping at my door. A neighbor, curious about our behavior, asked about the painting and suggested we take it to an antiquarian specializing in unusual artifacts. The antiquarian, upon seeing the painting, became visibly uncomfortable. He explained that it had a dark reputation and had passed from owner to owner, each reporting strange events until they finally got rid of it. He said the house in the painting was known as the Shadow House, and whoever owned a piece invited its inhabitants into their home. Since then, the painting was removed and taken far away, but the echo of shadows never completely left our house. Sometimes at night, I still hear the faint sound of footsteps, and the walls seem to whisper, as if the house remembers what it once sheltered and waits for the day when that presence returns. Story 5. The Night Visitor. When I moved into a new house in the countryside, the first thing I noticed was the absolute silence at night. There were no sounds of cars, no neighbors, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant howl of a dog. At first, it was comforting, but over time, the silence began to feel oppressive, as if hiding something unseen. On the third night after moving in, I woke up around 2 a.m. with a strange feeling. It was as if a draft of cold air had passed over me, but the windows were shut. I sat up in bed, trying to figure out what had awakened me. Then I heard it, a soft, continuous scratching coming from the front door. My heartbeat quickened, but I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a lost cat. The following night, the sound returned, but this time it was more persistent. I got up and walked downstairs with a flashlight in hand. The scratching stopped as soon as I reached the last step. The silence that followed was so thick I could almost hear it. I waited a few minutes but nothing happened. I went back to bed but sleep never came. The next night the sound changed. It wasn't scratching anymore but a gentle knock, as if someone were politely rapping at the door. My mind struggled against logic. Who would knock at such an hour in such a remote place? Taking a deep breath, I grabbed the flashlight again and walked down, now with more determined steps. When I reached the door, I felt a presence on the other side. I peered through the peephole but saw only darkness. With trembling hands, I unlocked the door and opened it a crack. The cold night air rushed in but no one was there. The empty road stretched out before the house, bathed in moonlight, and the wind whispered softly through the trees. Just as I was about to shut the door, I heard a whisper beside me, "You opened it?" I jumped back, the shock paralyzing me for a moment. I glanced around but saw nothing. I slammed the door shut and locked all the bolts I could find. I spent the rest of the night awake with the lights on, listening to the knocking that resumed, insistent yet patient. The next day, I mentioned it to the owner of a local store. He looked at me with a serious expression and asked, "Did you open the door?" My silence confirmed his suspicion. He explained that years ago, a pale, expressionless figure was said to walk the roads on the darkest nights, knocking on doors. And if someone opened it, he would wait outside until he was invited in. Determined to protect myself, I bought extra locks and even salt, which the store owner suggested placing on the windows and door. That night, the silence returned. The air was tense and the slightest sound seemed magnified. Shortly after 2 a.m., the knocking returned, now louder and more urgent. The whisper also came back, almost like a chant, repeating, "You opened it, let me in." Fear washed over me and I stood in the living room, watching the door tremble slightly as if something was pushing from outside. I closed my eyes and whispered a prayer, until the noise stopped abruptly. When I opened my eyes, I saw the window pane next to the door had fogged up, and handprints slowly appeared, as if someone had pressed their fingers against the glass, trying to peer inside. I stayed awake until dawn, and by morning the glass was clear with no trace of the hands. But the feeling that something was still outside, waiting, never went away. Since then, I never opened the door at night again. And on the coldest nights, I can still hear the knocking, followed by the whisper that travels with the wind, "You opened it." Story 6. The Hallway Light. When I started renting a small apartment in an old building downtown, I was fascinated by the intricate architecture and nostalgic atmosphere. The solid wooden doors, narrow hallways, and stained glass windows added undeniable charm. But soon I noticed something unsettling. There was a ceiling light in the hallway outside my apartment that flickered intermittently, casting unsteady shadows on the walls. The janitor, an elderly, quiet man, always said the building had its own personality and that I would have to get used to it. In the first weeks, the flickering light didn't bother me much, but one night, while reading in my living room, I noticed something odd. The hallway light began to flicker in a rhythmic pattern, as if someone were deliberately manipulating it. I went to the door and looked through the peephole but saw only an empty hallway, shadows dancing with each blink of the light. I returned to the living room trying to brush off the uneasiness, but then I heard a low, dragging sound, like something moving slowly down the hall. This time I opened the door and the light stopped flickering instantly. The hallway was empty again, but the sense that something was hidden in the shadows lingered. I closed the door, took a deep breath, and tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. The next night, around the same time, I woke to a peculiar sound, a faint tapping as if fingers were tapping on the glass of the light fixture. I stood up and went to the door, hesitating before opening it. Through the peephole, I saw the light flicker faster, and for a brief moment, a tall, thin shadow passed under the light and vanished. My heart pounded, and I stepped back from the door, feeling the air in the room grow colder. I shared what was happening with a neighbor from the upper floor who looked concerned. He said that hallway had always been strange and that decades ago, a woman had mysteriously disappeared from the building, last seen near that light. He mentioned that since then, residents reported seeing shadows and hearing footsteps when the hallway darkened. That night, determined to face my fear, I stood by the door watching the light through the peephole. Hours passed without incident, and I began to feel foolish for staying there so long. But shortly after 3 a.m., the light flickered again, and the tall shadow appeared, this time stopping in front of my door. It had no face, only a dark outline that trembled slightly. A scratching sound on the door began slowly, creating a noise that seemed to echo inside my head. I backed away, locking the door tighter as if it would protect me. The light stopped flickering and the hallway fell silent. But the sound of heavy, slow footsteps echoed, as if the figure was walking away, only to return another night. Since then, I avoid looking down the hallway at night. Residents continue to comment on the flickering light, but no one admits hearing the footsteps or seeing the shadow. The janitor, with his distant gaze, simply says, "The building has its own personality, and some doors should never be opened." Now, every time the light starts to flicker, I know I am not alone. And even with the door locked, the feeling that something is on the other side, waiting, never fades. Story 7. The Scarecrow of the Abandoned Farm. I grew up in a small town surrounded by farms and endless fields. One of the most feared places was an old, abandoned farm, with a scarecrow that stood out in the middle of the dry, forgotten field. Its structure was skeletal, made of twisted branches and covered with an old, tattered coat. What truly made the scarecrow terrifying were its eyes, two black stones that seemed to watch whoever passed by. The children in town swore it moved at night, but I always thought it was just a story to scare us. One afternoon, my friends and I decided to prove that those stories were just legends. We went to the farm, walking through the tall, dry grass that whispered under the wind. The silence was strange, as if the entire field was holding its breath. The scarecrow was there, motionless, its coat swaying lightly. I approached to take a closer look and noticed that the black stone eyes were positioned in such a way that they did seem to follow you. "Come on, it's just sticks and straw," said Lucas, laughing nervously. He dared to give the scarecrow a slight push, making it sway from side to side before settling back into place. At that moment, a gust of wind blew past us, carrying the scent of damp earth and something more, something rotten. The wind seemed to whisper, a low sound that almost formed words. We decided to head back before the sun fully set. But that night, something woke me up. I looked out the window facing the distant fields and saw a dark, elongated shadow. It looked like the scarecrow, but it was out of place, closer to the fence that bordered the town. I blinked, trying to shake off sleep, but the shadow didn't disappear. Instead, it seemed to have moved slightly, tilting its head. The next morning, I went to Lucas's house to tell him what I'd seen. He was pale and agitated. He said that during the night, he had heard soft tapping on his window and, when he looked, saw the silhouette of a thin man with long arms touching the glass. He swore the eyes glowed like the scarecrow's black stones. We tried telling our parents, but they laughed and said we spent too much time listening to ghost stories. We decided that night we would stay awake, each at home watching the window. Around midnight, I heard the sound of shuffling footsteps outside, the same sound the wind made as it swept through the dry grass. The silhouette was back, now closer to my house, standing by the gate. The stone eyes reflected the moonlight, and the tattered coat seemed to move on its own. Lucas called me, his voice trembling, saying the figure was in front of his house too. "It's closer now," he whispered before the call dropped. Fear gripped me, and suddenly the sound of a soft tap echoed at my window. The scarecrow was there, motionless, but its eyes were fixed on me. I heard a whisper from somewhere nearby, "You shouldn't have come." The rest of the night was a blur of fear. I lay there, staring at the window until dawn. When the sun finally rose, the figure was gone. I ran to Lucas's house and found him awake, his eyes red and expression haunted. We agreed never to return to that farm and kept the scarecrow as our secret. To this day, no one dares approach that abandoned field. But on the darkest nights, some townspeople claim they hear the wind whispering words and see a thin figure watching the town from afar, waiting for someone brave enough to challenge it again. Story 8. The Radio at the Abandoned Station. In the small town where I grew up, there was an abandoned railway station long forgotten with time. The rusted tracks led nowhere, and the station's broken windows were boarded up and covered in cobwebs. But what made the place truly eerie was an old radio that, according to local stories, still played music from bygone eras when night fell. They said it was a station that never stopped broadcasting, even decades after it had been abandoned. One evening, my friend Raphael and I decided to investigate the story. We went to the station at dusk as the sky began to shift to shades of purple and orange. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant chirping of crickets and the wind whistling through broken window panes. We entered the station with our flashlights, illuminating the swirling dust in the air. Inside there were old benches, scattered papers on the floor, and a ticket booth with peeling paint. In the corner, on top of a worn-out wooden table, sat the infamous radio. It was large, with rusted knobs and a cracked display. Raphael laughed, saying it was just a silly legend, but as he took a step back, the radio emitted a faint crackle of static. We froze. The sound grew louder, like someone tuning the frequency. A soft piano melody began to play, sad and haunting. We exchanged uneasy glances, and Raphael tried to turn off the radio, but the knobs wouldn't move. The music continued, and a raspy voice whispered between the notes, "You're listening to the station that never sleeps." Fear crept over us, and we stepped back as the melody shifted into something more sinister, a string arrangement that made the room feel colder. I glanced at the radio and saw the lights flickering erratically. Raphael grabbed my arm, whispering that we should leave, but before we could move, the voice returned, now more urgent. "Don't leave." The doors of the station slammed shut, and the temperature dropped even further. The music stopped, leaving a suffocating silence. We heard the creak of footsteps on the wooden floor, and a tall, shadowy figure passed by one of the windows. Our flashlights flickered, and when the light returned, the shadow was gone, but the radio started playing again, repeating the piano melody. The sound seemed to come from all directions, and then we heard a low laugh as if someone was amused by our fear. They heard it too, the voice whispered, sending a chill down my spine. It felt as if the entire station was alive, breathing, and waiting for us. We managed to push one of the doors open and ran into the street. The music and laughter followed us until we reached the end of the road, where the silence of the night finally enveloped us. When I looked back, the station appeared as just an old, forgotten building, but the faint light of a lantern, which had never worked before, flickered. I swore I could hear the distant sound of the radio, bidding farewell with a soft whisper. Until next night? The next morning we tried telling people what had happened, but no one believed us. Some said it was just the imagination of impressionable young people, but others gave us a look of silent understanding and veiled fear. Since then, I avoid passing by the station at night, and sometimes when the wind blows in a certain way, I can hear the piano melody drifting through the air, reminding me that the station still waits for its listeners. Story 9. The Occupant of the Red Armchair. In my great-grandmother's house, there was a red armchair that always made me uneasy. It was an old piece with carved wooden details and worn-out velvet fabric. The armchair sat in the corner of the parlor, where the sunlight never quite reached. My great-grandmother, a sharp-eyed woman with a soft voice, always said not to sit there. "That chair is his," she'd whisper, never explaining who he was. Over time, I started avoiding that room, but one rainy afternoon while visiting her, a loud thunderclap made me jump and seek shelter there. I entered the dim room with the scent of aged wood and old books filling the air. I sat in the red armchair, feeling the cold fabric under my hands. A shiver ran down my spine, but I ignored it. For a moment, all was silent, and even the rain seemed distant, muffled. I closed my eyes for a second, and that's when I felt it, a heavy, invisible pressure on my shoulders, like cold hands had rested there. I opened my eyes quickly, and the room seemed darker, as if the shadows had crept up the walls and ceiling. I jumped up, but the sensation of being watched lingered. Looking back at the armchair, I swore I saw the fabric dip slightly, as if an unseen person was seated. I told my great-grandmother what had happened, and she looked at me with a serious, saddened expression. "You woke him," she said in a hushed voice. "Long ago, a man lived in this house. He loved that chair more than anything. When he died, part of him stayed behind, waiting for someone who dared disturb him. The nights that followed were marked by strange occurrences. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway leading to the parlor, always stopping at the door. One night, I heard a faint whisper from the hallway, "Come back." I closed my eyes tightly, trying to ignore it, but a creaking sound like wood breaking echoed, and the parlor door creaked open by itself. The red armchair stood there, unmoving, but something was different. The darkness around it seemed deeper, and the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I decided to tell my mother about what had been happening. She frowned and admitted that, as a child, she also heard footsteps and whispers but thought they were just nightmares. She said the armchair had belonged to her grandfather, a stern, reclusive man who would sit there for hours without saying a word, staring into space. The next night, I approached the room with a lit candle and stood in front of the armchair. "What do you want?" I whispered, feeling my heartbeat hammering in my chest. The candle flickered, and the shadow cast on the wall behind the armchair seemed to form a pale face with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. The air grew colder and the candle went out. In the darkness, the whisper came again, closer and clearer this time. "You shouldn't have sat here." I ran out of the room and locked the door. My great-grandmother, with her weary voice, only said, "Now he knows you're here." Since then, the house has felt different, as if something is watching every move. And every time I pass by the hallway, I hear a faint scratching coming from the parlor and feel that if I look under the door, I will see two bright eyes watching me, waiting for me to return to the red armchair. Story 10. The House of Portraits. When I started working as a caretaker for an elderly lady named Donna Emilia, I didn't know my life would change forever. She lived in an old mansion in the most isolated part of the city, a place that seemed to come from another century, with creaking wooden floors and a massive fireplace that was rarely used. But what intrigued me the most were the portraits hanging on the walls. They were paintings of family members with solemn expressions, eyes that seemed to follow you as you walked, and smiles that never reached their eyes. Donna Emilia was a frail woman of few words, but her gaze seemed to know more than she let on. "The portraits hold the house's history," she once said when she caught me staring at one of the oldest paintings. A man with a thick mustache and a stern look. "They watch. Make sure they stay where they are." That night, as I was organizing books in the library, I heard faint footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, but no one was there. The sound seemed to come from the corridor where the portraits hung. My heart raced as I walked over and noticed that one of the paintings, the man with the mustache, was slightly askew. I straightened it and felt a chill run down my spine, as if a cold breath had passed by me. I went back to my room, but sleep was elusive. In the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of something dragging across the floor. I got up and peered into the corridor. The moon's faint glow illuminated the portraits just enough for me to see something was amiss. The painting of the man with the mustache lay on the floor, face down, and the others seemed slightly tilted, as if they had shifted on their own. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but as I picked up the painting, I heard a low, raspy whisper, "Don't touch." Instinctively, I stepped back, leaving the painting on the floor with the unnerving sensation that the man's eyes were watching me even upside down. The next morning, Donna Emilia looked paler than usual. I asked if she had heard anything during the night, and she just shook her head. "They are restless," she said, avoiding my eyes. "The house knows when something changes." Over the following nights, the noises continued. Soft knocks, dragging footsteps, and the sound of creaking wood as if someone were pacing the hallway, stopping outside the doors. One night, I decided to stay awake and watch. Around 3 a.m., I saw something that froze me in place. The painting of the man with the mustache was tilted again, but this time, his expression had changed. The faint smile was gone, and his eyes, once looking straight ahead, now glared at me with fury. The hallway grew colder, and a chill swept over me. The fireplace in the living room flared up on its own, the flames flickering wildly. The whisper returned, now clearer, "You disturbed them." Fear gripped my muscles, but before I could react, a shadow moved across the wall, a tall, imposing silhouette drawing closer. Donna Emilia appeared in the doorway of the hallway, her face full of urgency. "Go back to your room now," she said, her voice firm for the first time. I shut my door and sat on the floor, listening to the muffled sounds of low voices and whispers coming from the corridor. The next morning, the portraits were back in their places, but the man with the mustache still had a look of menace. Donna Emilia never spoke of the portraits again, and I completed my work without venturing near that hallway at night. But to this day, whenever I pass by that house, I feel the man's eyes following me, a reminder that some stories are meant to stay silent, trapped forever in the walls that guard them. If you made it this far, the mystery has hooked you. So, leave your like, subscribe, and hit the bell to follow each new story. Thanks for watching and see you in the next terror.